As a dad, I can't help but appreciate the new administration's commitment to American families. And it's inspiring to see Donald, JD, and Elon being proud fathers in public. Soon after taking office, Trump got to work implementing policies focused on the good of America's families. Policies like pulling children out of schools and churches to deport them, attacking funding for basic needs like Medicaid and SNAP, a food benefits program, as well as education and student loan funds, and establishing America as a two-gender nation. While these policies might sound distinctly bad for families, we've been assured that this is all for the greater good of creating a prosperous future for America's familial units and especially our children.
We will take care of children in this country.
But guys, clearly none of this is about the flourishing and safety of families. Rather, these policies are firmly establishing Trump's authoritarian agenda. And this emphasis on the family is just a smokescreen to push through policies that actively harm vulnerable groups like trans kids, queer people, working families, and teachers. Even more insidious is that this call for a return to the family is really a call for the reproduction of white families fueled by racist paranoia like the Great Replacement theory.
Illegal immigrants, which I think have a very strong bias to, at least everything I've read, it's a very strong bias to vote Democrat. The more that come into the country, the more they're likely to vote in that direction.
So today, we're going to look at the history of the American family and talk about how both white supremacy and neoliberalism have used the family to perpetuate an agenda that is more fascist-friendly than it is family-friendly. Before I keep going, I want to tell you about today's sponsor, Storyblocks. Now, Storyblocks is the complete stock solution that provides unlimited downloads of diverse and high-quality media for one predictable subscription cost, so say goodbye to expensive pay-per-clip pricing. Storyblocks' curated library has everything you need, with over 1 million 4K HD clips, templates, music, sound effects, images, and more, and they regularly commission content to enhance the diverse media library, ensuring high quality and representation. Now, many other stock providers make licensing expensive and complicated, which is why Storyblocks created 2 clear-cut licenses with comprehensive coverage so you can get back the time you'd spend wading through legal jargon and create with confidence. Now here at Wisecrack, we legit love Storyblocks. Back in the day, before we knew any better, we were trying to use free stock footage and Creative Commons footage, and it just took forever and made our lives miserable, and then in the end didn't really look that good. But now we're using Storyblocks, so our lives are easier, our production process is faster, and our videos look great. So to get started with unlimited stock media downloads at one set price, head to storyblocks.com/wisecrack or click the link in the description. Now let's get back to learning about the politics of family. While we might think of the family as something that's just always existed, its modern incarnation didn't really come on the scene until the emergence of capitalism. As Silvia Federici argues in Caliban and the Witch, an essential feature of the emergence of capitalism was not just privatizing the means of production, the farmlands where the peasantry used to live and work, but also privatizing social reproduction within the family, meaning privatizing the literal reproductive process. While under feudalism, productive and reproductive work were shared both within and across households, under capitalism they were separated, and reproductive labor was privatized to be performed within the family by women. Now, while childcare once involved fathers, siblings, extended family, and neighbors, it was now solely the domain of mothers. And while this all emerged in Europe, Federici notes that colonization exported this vision of family across the world. Indigenous peoples were attacked and violently forced to conform to European norms around family and, crucially, property. For example, within British colonial occupied areas, including the budding New World, only people in certain kinds of heterosexual relationships were legally able to own property. And this all made the idealized white family an essential building block on the journey from colonization to the American nation. And this mythical white family has been a key factor of American history and culture ever since. Now, a lot of the trad wife or return content that you might see today appeals to an idealized image of the perfect nuclear family of the 1950s. But this ideal was always overtly racialized. For example, black families often included working mothers who, also carried out care labor, plus extended communities which shared in that domestic labor. Now that meant grandparents, cousins, uncles, and the community at large all pitched in on care work. But because of this, they were often demonized as a source of national disunity. The Moynihan Report from 1965 argued that black poverty was the result of matriarchal, fatherless black families which served to emasculate men and destroy the family. The supposed failure of the black family to conform to a rigid definition was, and still is, understood as a threat to the entire nation.
When you don't, as a black father, get involved in your little girls' lives or your little boys' lives specifically, then you're adding to the lost generation.
Through the media of the 1950s and 60s, we can see anxieties about threats to the nuclear family were understood as threats to society as a whole. Consider the Addams Family, first broadcast in the 1960s. In contrast to their neighbors, the ghoulish Addams Family is an extended network rather than just a closed nuclear unit.
Keep telling you the Addams are not an average family at all.
The show's central irony is that while their existence is monstrous to American WASP society, the Addamses are the only family who seem to genuinely love each other, and this is a theme that reappears in the 90s films. Furthermore, both the 60s and 90s renditions of the Addams Family satirized fears about immigrant families undermining societal norms. The Addamses are signaled to be relatively recent immigrants, whether they are being coded as Latino,
Mamacita! We forgot our ancestral land, Spain.
or Eastern European. Their ethnicity and form of family makes them other to their white neighbors, demonstrating how the national ideal of the nuclear family is predicated on the exclusion of the other. Now, while the Addamses are accepting of everyone, they threaten the clearly demarcated lines of the nuclear family that serve to protect the nation. Now, the title of the 1993 film Addams Family Values is a direct response to Republican use of family values to exclude gay people, just as politicians today invoke family values in their attempts to legislate trans people out of existence.
Transgenderism must be eradicated from public life entirely.
When Musk or Trump push their family credentials into the limelight, it's not an innocent, take your child to inauguration day. It's a demonstration that they uphold the family values of American white supremacy. But this ideology doesn't lead to policies which actually make having a family any easier in America. If anything, it's the opposite. And I can actually speak to this. I didn't realize until I had kids how expensive it is. You gotta be lucky to have a job that even lets you take the time off. And then if you gotta work, what you gotta do to afford the kid, you have to do daycare or preschool, which is so expensive and there's like no government support for that. So it's very hard to square all of the family values stuff with the way in which having a family feels almost financially impossible these days. Now, if the concept of the nuclear family feels a little bit out of date, well, that's because it is. Its prevalence has been declining since the 1970s, and alternative forms of family have been increasingly normalized. But that doesn't mean that this ideal has declined in power. In fact, the rise of neoliberalism reinforced some of the most essential family values. In the early to mid 20th century, American welfare programs like aid to families with dependent children worked on what's called a family wage system, redistributing income to families based around the nuclear family ideal, thus encouraging that specific form of family. Now, this might sound good in theory, but in practice it proved problematic. As Melinda Cooper argues, the family wage system upheld the nuclear family's gendered division of labor while policing the boundaries of what a family should look like. Black men were often excluded from the benefits of the family wage system, and black women were demonized as drains to society, welfare queens who threatened the family ideal.
In Chicago, they found a woman who holds the record. She used 80 names, 30 addresses, 15 telephone numbers to collect food stamps, Social Security, veterans benefits for 4 non-existent deceased veterans' husbands, as well as welfare.
As theorist Paul Gilroy argues, family is not just the site of cultural reproduction. It is also identified as the mechanism for reproducing the cultural dysfunction that disables the race as a whole. Now, the anxiety around welfare queens partly drove the neoliberalization of the system, which, according to Cooper, transformed welfare from the family wage system to a reignition of a Victorian poor law tradition. Essentially, the neoliberal state shifted responsibility for family care off of the shoulders of the state and back into the realm of the family.
Reagan's vision of America sparked a conservative revolution. Its motto, "Government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem."
And the welfare opportunities that did remain, like temporary assistance for needy families, well, Melinda Cooper points out that it continued to facilitate the state's policing of the family norm. And the US pursued an extreme form of this policing with its attacks on women's abortion rights. The US doing extreme forms of policing? Who would have thunk? Now, part of the change from the post-war Fordist regime to neoliberalism was women who were previously housewives entering the national labor force. Suddenly, women who could afford it could escape the patriarchal financial dependence on the family wage. Yay, you did it, feminism won. But this wasn't the end of the family. Instead, these kinds of welfare regimes disciplined women into performing both waged labor and household domestic labor. The state had a vested interest in keeping women housewives, even if they were still workers.
The Labor Department says on the average day, 49% of women do housework like laundry and cleaning. That's compared to just 19% of men.
And to this day, studies show that women who work full-time still carry out a majority of domestic labor. Alongside these state methods, neoliberalism utilized economics to uphold the family. For example, household debt is disproportionately held by women due to factors like lower incomes and cost of caring for children. And household debt is spiraled during the emergence of neoliberalism. Now, this debt, coupled with the reinforcement of caring responsibilities and the lack of publicly provided welfare options, often traps women within family conditions they cannot easily escape. And as queer relationships become more accepted in America, it's often only in as much as they are monogamous and child-rearing, reduplicating the central features of the nuclear family. It's an unstable brand of inclusion that can be lost with a wave of politically motivated homophobia. Trump's trans-exclusionary executive order on gender shows the firm limits heteronormative recognition. Now, this type of formal political exclusion might feel cruelly arbitrary, but we can better understand the logic behind it by taking a look at the history of fascism. For the Nazis, the role of the masculine, racially pure German family was central. As Henry Mayer notes, fascism is characterized by a traditional understanding of gender roles, in which women are primarily expected to be childbearers and homemakers responsible for reproducing the white race. Realizing this vision required safeguarding family units from the feminizing influence of foreign Jews. Now, one of the earliest acts of institutional violence the Nazis enacted was the destruction of the research of Jewish doctor Magnus Hirschfeld's Sexual Science Institute in May 1933. Now, this was coupled with the destruction of gay and lesbian bars, eventually the arrest and forcible relocation of gay men to concentration camps. For the Nazis, any non-heteronormative sexuality could undermine the patriarchal family, subsequently the whole of German society. Now, we see something similar in the gender-obsessed policies of the Trump administration. Alongside his transphobic executive order, he's laid the groundwork for reinstating his ban on immigration from predominantly Muslim or Arab countries, and has already sent troops to the Mexican border to defend the nation. And as we film this, he's currently sending ICE agents into schools and churches. And Trump conflated the nation with the family in his inauguration speech.
We are one people, one family, and one glorious nation under God.
Both transphobia and anti-immigration rhetoric are invoked to protect women, specifically the real women who are deemed biologically capable of becoming mothers. And these women are supposedly under constant threats from both trans women and immigrants. This neoliberal ideal of protecting the family from immigrants or trans people rests on the heteronormative ideal of the family, which basically means the heteronormative family is threatened by anyone that doesn't fit the mold of the heteronormative family. Now, this has been visibly projected not only by the recent trad wife phenomenon, but also in neo-Nazi slogans like the 14 Words, which appeals to securing a future for white children. These appeals to civilization and the family are not in tension with the neoliberal drive to maintain the private family unit. Instead, fascist and transphobic moral panics about familial destruction interact with neoliberalism's forms of patriarchy, and what this all does is intensify racism, homophobia, and misogyny. In other words, even if neoliberalism doesn't share the overt racism of fascism at the ideological level, at the practical level, they're basically chasing a similar result. Now, we've seen much of this coalesce into the hysteric fear of demographic decline. And despite attempts to force the family into existence, it's harder than ever for most Americans to even afford a family. And really ask yourself, if these guys really cared about the family, right? If that's what they really wanted, I don't know, let people have more time off when they have kids, pay for their medical bills if they're having kids, have government-funded childcare programs. I don't know. Now, this includes many white Americans, and the resulting demographic decline has been a source of anxiety on the right for years, leading to the popularity of the Great Replacement Theory. This is a racist conspiracy theory parroted by people like Elon Musk. This conspiracy synthesizes many of the themes we've been discussing, right? The fears of the decline of the pure white family are fears of national decline in miniature. The idea of other nations and people outbreeding American or Western European nations signals nothing short of societal collapse for these folks. Now, the history of the family is complex and contradictory. You know, it's not an eternal, unchanging institution. It's something that morphs and shifts to fit particular context, which is good. But what is worrying about this moment is the way in which the family is being used to rally support for a dangerous far-right political turn, all while those same people are undermining the very resources which make it possible to have a family in the first place. Well, wasn't this a fun one? I would love to hear what you think in the comments, so please tell me. Big shout out to all of our patrons. Thank you so much for your support. If you're interested in getting our videos early without ads, access to our Discord server, things of that nature, please do click the link in the description. Subscribe, like the video, ring the bell if you haven't. You hear it a lot, but it helps. And in the meantime, remember, no matter what, we are family.